Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Ben Kinsley has joined me. He's the executive director for Campaign for Vermont and co-producer and co-host.
Thank you, Pat.
How are you? And a very special guest, a friend from ages, well, I shouldn't say ages, just the other day, is Dean George. And Dean is the chair of the Vermont Parole Board. Dean, welcome. I'm so excited.
Thank you, Pat. It's great to see you.
This is great. Thank you.
Nice to see you too.
Yes. I don't know. I was thinking about Dean when I invited him on. I think, I don't know anything about the parole board at all, and I should, given some of my jobs. I was just telling Dean, the only thing I remember is on Law and Order, Jack McCoy always says, and I'm going to your parole hearing and make sure you never get out. So there you go.
Well, you know, Pat, even though I spent 30 years of my career in the state police, I really never had any interaction with the parole board either until getting involved in this.
Yes. Have you never testified before?
Never had to testify before any parole. I knew, you know, when people were on parole and occasionally they got violated and we arrested them and that sort of thing, but it wasn't very often.
Well, this is certainly a real centerpiece for our law enforcement, and I thought we should know about this. But first, you have to tell us a little bit of your background.
Well, I'm a native Vermonter. I grew up in St. Johnsbury, and after I graduated from the University of Vermont many years ago, I joined the state police and had a career with the state police for 30 years. And when I retired, I was actually in the legislature, a little ahead of you, representing Middlebury. I served on our town select board for 20 years. I finally found a way to not run again about 2 years ago.
Congratulations.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
and it was great.
Research, you were involved in a couple of really serious issues in town, and I thought, good grief, this guy's a glutton for punishment.
I know, but we got some great results from it, which is good. And gosh, about 12 years ago when Jim Douglas was governor, he had invited me to meet with him and talk about joining the parole board. And that was, at that time, the parole board was in a bit of flux because there had been some issues with training, qualifications of people that were serving on the parole board, the work they did. At that time, there was a director who was actually an employee of the Department of Corrections. And parole board members were appointed. They didn't get any training. There really was no guidance, although there's quite a bit of statutory authority and regulations that pertain to how parole board members do their work. And it was during that time period when the legislature was looking at removing the executive director of the parole board from the Department of Corrections and making it an independent entity. And that started the process. And I looked through the review of what had been written by the consultant who had come in to look at Vermont's parole board. And one of the glaring issues was there was no proper rules and procedures manual in place. And that was, when I accepted this, one of the things that we first went to work on. I worked with the Attorney General's office. We were given a consultant from the National Institute of Corrections to work with us, and we developed our policy and procedures manual, which you've read through.
Which I have just read. I've read the whole thing.
And what's
I'm the
really
next candidate for the parole board.
What's really nice about it, it reflects all the statutes and court decisions that reflect different aspects of what the parole board does. So training became a really important component of parole board background. So whenever a new person comes on the parole board, we send them to a training for new parole board members, which now is conducted in Colorado, which is paid for by the feds. And we belong to the Organization of Paroling Authorities nationwide, and occasionally get to go to conferences where we meet with other parole boards from other states in the country and interact, which has been fabulous.
So when Governor Douglas knocked on your door, what did you think?
Well, I thought this was really interesting, and at the time, I was not interested in walking in and being the chair of the board, because I really didn't have any experience doing it yet. So I did get appointed as a board member, and then a year later, when the then chair left, I was appointed as the chair.
Who did that? The governor or the board itself elects?
The governor.
The governor. Oh, interesting.
The board itself elects its vice chair.
Oh, okay.
Which is a wonderful woman who lives up in Enosburg, and she's been on the board longer than I have, many years longer, and does a fantastic job. And so the board has a makeup of people from around the state with different backgrounds and interests, but everyone works really well together, and that's what makes it interesting for me, is to have people.
You really have to do your homework before.
And even though we're all retired, because you kind of have to be to do this, to be committed, it does take a fair amount of time and investment in your.
Well, we were talking before the show. He has 26 hearings tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
How do well, you
In
can
Newport.
explain how in Newport
Yeah.
how you do that, but
Right. So one of the things we do is the parole board by statute has to conduct parole hearings for every offender who's eligible for parole, and they become eligible if they're sentenced for their crime. They get a minimum and a maximum sentence. At the minimum date, they're eligible for parole. And so unless they waive that hearing, we meet with them. And we encourage those that are not probably going to get parole for one reason or another to still meet with us, because we want to have the opportunity to talk with them about what things they should be doing to prepare themselves better for parole. So we do these hearings at each site around the state. There are 16 sites, as I
yeah,
think I
right.
was
He's
telling
all
you.
over the place.
So we schedule.
So this is only a part-time job?
Yeah, that's what
Yes,
he told
it
me.
is,
It's a
yeah,
part-time
yeah,
job. I don't
yeah.
think so.
And then, so we'll meet with folks at each site. We'll travel, board members, and we schedule 3 of us at each hearing.
So you mentioned a few minutes ago that when you came on, was it the existing chair of the board was a Department of Corrections employee?
No, there are 3 employees of the parole board
Okay.
office. There was the executive
Staff.
director, who was an employee of the Department of Corrections. There was the office manager and a secretary,
Gotcha.
3 people.
And now it's separate. It's an independent.
So now the executive director is also appointed by the governor, but interestingly enough, the parole board interviews and recommends to the governor the person that should have that position. So
Gotcha.
it's an opportunity for the parole board to find the right person for the executive director, recommend it to the governor, who can
Right.
choose not to appoint
Right,
that person,
right.
but at least the 2 are working together, and that's worked out really well.
Kind of what we do with like the Secretary of Education is a similar
Yes,
process.
right,
It
exactly.
is,
Yeah.
yes.
Exactly.
So I'm curious. So was it seen to be like a conflict of interest to have the executive director of the parole board inside the Department of Corrections? Because
It
I can
was.
see there can be
Yeah,
issues
there
there.
is. I mean, when you're dealing with parole-related issues, the body that makes a decision needs to be independent of influence from either side of the coin on this.
Right.
so
So either
to
the
say.
prosecutor or the
Right.
You know.
So we sit independently, and 2 years ago, the legislature actually formally changed the statute to recognize the parole board as an independent entity, where before it wasn't.
Yeah.
So you sort of report to the governor.
We really
as-
do.
as
Yeah,
a-
even though this board is part of the Agency of Human Services, I direct my issues to the governor's
Right.
legal counsel.
Right.
And oftentimes we will talk about high-profile cases or things of that nature, but I keep them abreast of things that are going on. So yes, it's kind of a,
So you're still inside the agency that oversees the Department of Corrections, but you're not inside the Department of
we're
Corrections.
inside it in terms of funding, exactly.
yeah.
But we
Payroll and
right,
all
and
that
our staff provide a lot of training for Department of Corrections caseworkers and parole officers
Yeah.
because they have to prepare their cases for us, and there's a turnover of new people coming in, and so it's an opportunity for particularly our administrative staff to meet with caseworkers to review what's required by the parole board, how you conduct yourself at a hearing, and so forth. And so that's been a good process for us. So we have what's called a parole summary report. So someone who's coming before us, the parole officer or the caseworker are the ones that are supervising folks who are incarcerated. The parole officer are ones that are supervising people in the community. So they submit this report to us, and then we have this report ahead of time. When we electronically we will review all these cases, like the ones we've got for tomorrow. We've all
Right.
reviewed them. And then the caseworker / parole officer will present to us what's been happening. Then we'll do an interview, and then at the end of the interview, we make a decision to grant parole or not. And if we grant parole, then we will explain what the conditions are going to be for that parole. We try to specifically address conditions that are appropriate to that individual, the crime that they've been involved in, any victim issues, that sort of thing. So we want them to be successful, obviously.
So the mission statement of the board is essentially an independent entity that considers eligible offenders for parole, rendering decisions by balancing items like things like victims' needs and the risk to the public and other things like that. And you ultimately have to come to a decision, right?
Correct. So we also have, in the year since I've been on, we have developed what's called a risk instrument tool. So at each hearing, we have a risk instrument that we complete. Now, corrections has their own risk instruments for different types of programming and that sort of thing. We do our own, which measures dynamic and static events in this person's life that comes up with a risk for us before we do the interview. So we will come up with either a high, medium, or low risk rating for that individual. And so as we're interviewing them, we know they're either high risk or low risk or medium risk.
For reoffending, or is it based on what they've
To
done?
be
in-
successful on parole.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And then we would establish the criteria that we think are appropriate for them to be successful on parole. And as much as possible, when victims are involved, we love to hear from victims. And unfortunately, Pat, in the court system, too many times cases are resolved without there being a trial through a plea agreement or whatever, and many times the victims are not
Oh, sure,
participating.
they don't get their
So this is their
chance.
first time to
Yep,
sort of weigh
right.
in. And a lot of times there's a lot of pent-up anger and
Sure.
resentment, and sometimes there's a lot of fear, which is certainly understandable. So we try to work closely with the victim of an incident and try to make them part of the process of getting this person back into the community and helping assign what's going to be an appropriate
I'm
condition.
just, obviously, when you're back about the issue of recidivism, do you know what that percentage is? Is it high, or how are we doing?
It's, it depends on the age. Again, that comes back to the
Oh,
risk.
really?
Yeah, about 90% of what we see are between 16 and 24-year-olds in
Oh, no,
terms of
that's
new
depressing.
offenses. So, if you look at our risk assessment, age is a factor, whether a person's working, their
Right,
their
sure. They got
their
support
criminal
from
history,
family.
right,
Yeah.
and if they're married or single and
Yeah.
things like that, all help us kind of measure what that would be. But when you say recidivism, it's really about, from the people that we put on parole, how many of them come back in a parole violation hearing, which is a much different animal
Yeah.
than the parole eligibility hearing.
Right.
I didn't put this, I attended one time in Barry at the Justice.
Mm-hmm.
They had an exercise that you went through, that you were a person just put on parole. And it was, you had to find housing, food, job, I mean, all this stuff. And then at the end of the exercise, saw whether you were successful or not. It was very difficult
Yeah.
to get any of those things done, to find a place I could afford. It was really enlightening. They had a name for it, and if anybody has the chance
COSA?
to. COSA, yes.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was fabulous. It
A
was
lot of
really
times
worth it.
around the state, there are some fantastic COSA programs, and they actually come into parole hearings with the offender and sit with them, and they will tell us, this person's been under our supervision. We've helped get them housing. We've got them in vocational training.
Yeah.
They're doing treatment for their drug problem, and they're helping pay their restitution. All of these things.
That's
So
great.
it's great to have these
Yeah.
people involved in the community. Corrections does a great job of trying to get people help, to find housing for them, to get them started in the right direction.
We had two former inmates in that group with us, and they spoke. And it was, I don't think there was a dry eye in the
Yeah.
house. It's not an easy task.
No, it's
No, it
not.
isn't. It
Especially when it's not skills that you've had to use in
Right.
quite a while. I mean, you're coming
Or
into,
if you've never used them.
or you've never used. I mean, if
Yeah.
you were, a teen, like you said, half of your or most of your first-time offenders are between 16 and 24. Is that what you said?
Well, I'm saying the ones that are going to be seen again.
Yeah,
Right.
the recidivism.
Yeah,
ones.
Yeah.
it's very high for that age group.
And so,
Yeah.
like they may never have had those skills, and if they've been in,
What's really important for us is to focus on the positive and not to be looking back at the actual incident and regressing into continued punishment, that sort of thing. It's really
Right.
about how can we make changes in this person's life, get them back in our community, not dependent on corrections or anybody else, and be able to sustain themselves.
Right.
And
I think a lot of communities have stepped up, haven't they?
They have.
With a lot of support.
Right.
I know Barry's
Yes.
especially good at that.
there's a lot of great organizations around the state that do wonderful work.
Right.
And we get to see them, and like I said, a lot of times they'll come into the parole hearing, which is fantastic. They'll give
Well,
us
they're
their
all
input.
open to the public. I was
Our parole
surprised
hearings
at that,
are,
actually.
yes, yeah,
But-
it's,
So it's all public information that's
it
out there.
is. We follow the open meeting law.
Right.
The only time we would go into a deliberative session would be after we hear information
Oh.
to discuss amongst the three board members before publicly, and we publicly make our decisions. A lot of states don't do that, and we make our decisions in front of everybody
Wow.
and announce what it's going to be. And if we're not supporting granting parole at that time, then we pay particular attention to what needs to be done so we can get them on parole. And hopefully everyone leaves with a positive experience and knows that they can come back in a few months. If they've got this done or that done, the parole board's going to be ready.
So being denied doesn't necessarily, it doesn't
No.
mean that's over.
Absolutely
You have another
not.
chance, bite at the apple or something.
We actually tell them we don't set any timelines at all. If we aren't granting parole today, this is the reason why. So these are the things you need to work on. And we tell your caseworker or your parole officer that they can bring you back anytime they want.
Wow.
They can be seen if you're sentenced for a crime of less than 15 years maximum imprisonment. You can be seen every year if you write to the board and say your caseworker is not recommending you.
Yeah.
You can write to us and we'll see you every year. More than 15 years, it's every 2 years.
So in a year's time, if you're doing 26 tomorrow, how many people do you see either
We
the
usually have,
violation or?
yeah, we usually have around 1,000 to 1,200 hearings. Yeah.
A year?
I had no idea it was that much.
How many-
Well, like for tomorrow, Newport that's an unusually busy day.
Yeah.
Typically, our days are 10 to 15 hearings, which is plenty still.
Yeah, that's
but,
still a lot.
Yeah.
And you,
Again, this is a part-time gig.
But you were telling me, and I interrupted you before, what you do tomorrow is you split the board up, because you
Right.
have to have 3 hearing.
Well, when we do our schedule, we try to put in blocks of time for what we anticipate will be the average amount of time we spend at a hearing.
Right.
And with 26 hearings, there's no way we could do that in a
Right,
day, even
right.
if we had
No.
5-minute hearings, which we don't. So, as I said before, there are 5 regular board members and 2 alternates.
Right.
So when I do the schedule and I find out when we do our final schedule for Newport, I've got 26 hearings, I'll get a hold of 3 other board members that can make it, and I'll schedule 6 of us to go to
Yeah,
Newport.
that makes
And we'll
sense.
have 2 hearing panels working at the same
Right.
time.
So one of the things in your, on the manual talked about ethics, code of ethics and
Right.
conflict of interest.
Right.
Since you are an independent entity, if there
Right.
are any issues,
Right.
how do you handle that?
Well,
Amongst yourselves? or-
it's really done amongst ourselves. The main issue is, for us, the conflicts of interest are is it someone that you know, that someone's worked for you
This
or
is
you've worked for
Vermont,
them?
Dean.
Right, yeah.
Chances are fairly
Yeah,
good.
you know
Well,
somebody.
I mean, how well do you know them? In
Yeah,
what
right,
context do you know them?
right.
If you're, in one case, we've got one of our parole board members, an offender was actually, she was a victim indirectly, that her son was involved in an
Oh.
incident as a victim of a crime, and this was the offender. Obviously, she couldn't
yeah,
settle.
right.
If I was involved in a state police arrest of an individual, then I wouldn't sit on
Right.
that hearing. And fortunately, by being retired now 15
Yeah,
years, I
it's-
don't see too many, which is a good
They're
thing.
all somewhere
But
else.
yeah, if
Yeah.
there's any concerns about their ability to be unbiased in their decision-making, we talk about it, and we'll just let them step aside from that.
So there are more options available than just no, we're denying your parole, and yes, we are approving. There's a kind of a range of options in there. Can you explain some of those?
Sure. In fact, I brought a monthly report, which we do a summary of
Numbers,
it.
we like numbers.
Yeah,
We like
so,
numbers, yes.
for example, we do hearings for condition modifications. So if someone is on parole, and say they were arrested and convicted of 4 DWIs, and they were not allowed to drive, they've got a lifetime suspension of their driver's license. Well, while they're on parole, they have gone through what's called the total abstinence program, where they are sober for 3 years,
Right.
they don't drink, and they're eligible for that one-time opportunity to get their license back.
Right.
Or they qualify for the ignition interlock device with a restricted driver's license. Their parole officer can bring them back, and we'll schedule a hearing to modify the parole agreement to allow for that, or to eliminate a condition that no longer applies to them, or in some cases to add a condition.
Right.
Something has happened, it doesn't rise to the level of bringing them back for a violation. We just want to add this condition so we can properly supervise them. So we do those hearings. We do separate victim testimony hearings. For example, if a victim has concerns about being in the same room with the offender,
Okay.
but wants us to hear their story, we'll give them the opportunity to talk with us
right.
separately.
Do you tape that so that
No.
oh, no, interesting.
No. However, if it's a parole revocation hearing where they're entitled to due process represented by an attorney, and the victim happens to be a witness, then they they cannot be separated and they do have to be on the
Right,
record
'cause that's
for
not
what they
fair to
say.
the,
Well, it's presenting
offending,
evidence,
right.
right, right. So those are a little tricky. We do paroles to detainers. So, for example, if you were arrested in another state and that state has convicted you of that crime and there's a sentence for you to go to that state, but you're incarcerated in Vermont, they may issue us a detainer to the state of Vermont saying, we want this person. So if it's a concurrent sentence where both are occurring at the same time, but that state wants you back there to resolve
Oh,
that,
right.
we would do a hearing to parole you to that state, but parole for the specific purpose of serving out that detainer.
Right.
When that's done, if there's still time on your Vermont sentence, you got to come back, your parole is rescinded, you finish out your
Oh.
Vermont sentence. A lot of times we do what are called ICOTS cases. For example, if somebody comes up from the state of New York to sell drugs in Vermont, the only time they've ever been in Vermont was to sell drugs. They were arrested, convicted, sentenced. They come to their minimum sentence date, so they're eligible to be seen by the parole board, but they have no ties to the state
Right,
whatsoever.
right.
They don't live here, they don't have any family here, so we can consider paroling them back to their home state. So that's called an interstate compact
okay.
transfer. And every state has reciprocity with each other to do that. So we would do a preliminary hearing and say, okay, you want to go back to New York City, you were convicted of this, are drugs a problem for you, or you're just selling them? We try to figure that whole thing out. And then if we agree at the preliminary hearing that it makes sense for them to go back to their home state, then corrections would apply through the interstate compact for parole supervision to that state. And then once that state makes its decision, if they agree to it, it would come back to the parole board and we would do the final hearing, make sure that the conditions are proper for that individual, and then parole them to that state.
Oh.
And if they mess up, then they come back to Vermont.
Yeah.
So,
You've got a lot of child abuse people, domestic violence, and I'm sure there's a lot of people addicted to drugs. And I mean, how do you?
yeah,
what
probably
conditions do those
75
guys
to
face?
80% of the people that we
All
deal
of the
with have
above?
substance abuse.
Oh, great.
Yeah, it's
Right.
huge.
Yeah. Well, it's a growing problem.
Well,
I'm
and
hearing
mental
that.
illness too, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of.
Mental illness is an issue, but substance abuse is the biggest problem. So many of the other crimes are related to substance
Yeah, right,
abuse.
Right.
Getting money for drugs. and-
Domestic violence is
Right.
an ongoing issue. It's not unusual for us to have several cases a month where we have people on parole who are charged with domestic violence, so they come back before us with a parole violation, and it's the same thing that the courts are going through initially, and then the parole board has to, and get the evidence to determine whether or not what happened was sufficient enough to reincarcerate.
So are your proceedings as a parole board, are they quasi-judicial? Is that
Yes,
how it's
yes.
I think
it's
they get
structured?
sworn in, don't they?
Yeah,
Yes.
because I would have to imagine if you get someone back for a parole violation, that's got to be a very similar process
It is.
to a
And that's why I
courtroom.
said it's more of a due process hearing.
Mm-hmm.
They're entitled to be represented by an attorney. They are sworn in. We have to make a determination that there is a preponderance of evidence to find that they did violate the conditions that they're being charged with violating.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we make that decision, then we go into what's called disposition, and we talk about, okay, this person's on parole. We found them guilty of violating X, Y, and Z. Do we continue them on parole? Do we revoke their parole? Do we reprimand them? We have the option of doing a reprimand with an incarcerative sentence, so we can add a period of time for them to be incarcerated, but keep them on parole, sort of as
How does that work?
so if we found that you were guilty of violating several conditions of your parole, one of the options would be to keep you on parole, but do a reprimand and maybe incarcerate you for a week.
Oh, okay.
as part of
Which
the-
takes off your time out in the.
It does, and then when you're done with that, you come out and you're still on parole, which
Uh-huh,
is a good thing.
Yeah.
And many times they're arrested prior to the parole hearing, so they're incarcerated anyway, so sometimes we'll let that be considered time served in a case where we think, they understand what went wrong, it's not going to happen again, we'll keep them on parole, try to eliminate the need to revoke their parole and start the process over. But most of them, we do have to do
How do
that.
you train yourself, I have to get this wording right, to look at each case like a blank wall? Because I could see you getting a little, there's only so many excuses and reasons and rationale, and I'm sure you hear
Well-
them but you've got to, as a judge, you've
Yeah.
got to take a look at each person individually without thinking of all the other
You're right, and
excuses you've heard.
part of the mindset, Pat, is that we want people to be successful. And if you go in there with thinking, okay, we're going to condition everything under the sun so that there's no way this person's ever going to get in trouble again, there's no way they're going to be successful either.
Yeah, right.
They can't be.
Yeah.
So the approach is, all right, try to deal with the real issue of why they're there, make sure that's not going to happen again, put them in a direction where hopefully they're going to be able to work, get back with their family if they've got one, if not, start something on their own and be productive with it, and stay out of the criminal justice system. If we can get them into a drug treatment program, if substance abuse is the issue, that's critical. And we know that some of them are going to relapse. And if they relapse and we come back to a violation hearing, can we get them into some sort of a residential treatment program to be successful there? If you can deal with the underlying issue, then most of them are going to be
Well,
fine.
I guess that's the case in all other issues
Yeah.
that we're facing. It's the underlying issue.
Right.
We're good at addressing the,
The challenging ones are
Yeah.
the ones that are required to do treatment program, for example, some of the more heinous sex offenders and that sort of thing. And for one reason or another, they don't complete it. And that's a big one for us. That if you're going to come back in the community and you've committed this crime, we want to make sure you've completed
right.
the treatment program before we
And if
consider
somebody
it.
does have a mental illness and you release them into public, do you automatically set them up like with Washington County Mental Health, so there's a mental health connection?
There is typically, they've had the assessment for counseling,
Oh.
so we know what the assessment is recommending. So, yeah, if they're going to be into counseling, it's going to be in place before we put them on parole. And, you know, a lot of their revocations come back because they got out, they decided not to continue with counseling, and then as a result, they did this, this, and this. So we come back to square one again and say, you've
I'm
got to get
surprised
back into counseling.
They don't finish it because they know without it they can't.
Many do,
fine.
but as you know,
They
it's
just
human
frustrate.
nature. Some of these folks are not ready for that yet.
Yeah.
And
Right.
Well, that's a tough situation, I think.
Yeah.
We had Jolinda LeClaire on the show a couple months ago, and she's the chair or the director of the drug opioid council.
Council that the governor put together.
Right.
Right.
And she said one of the things that was really interesting, and I've heard it a couple times since she said it, is that people are much less likely to relapse if they have a job.
yeah,
And
So
it's significant.
it is.
And I've heard that several times since talking with her. Do you find that is also
Absolutely.
true with parolees?
Well, like I was telling you, we do our own risk assessment. One of the big factors in assigning risk is employment.
Right.
So we look at a couple of things. One, have you ever worked any place for any length of time? And try to get their work history. And if not, why not? And then, do you have something lined up for work when you get back in the community or and then on parole? What do you plan to do? Is there vocational training? Have you done something in the past? And, you know, sometimes we'll get people who come in who are on Social Security disability. And when they're on Social Security disability and not working, what do you do with your free time? That's where you get in trouble.
Right, sure.
So even those that are on Social Security disability, they can volunteer places. A lot of them can get part-time jobs doing different things, and when they do, it raises their self-esteem.
Right.
It's an opportunity for doing something other than getting in trouble, and they're successful. So, yeah, that's a huge
And I got to imagine that it's difficult for a lot of these people to get jobs. I mean, not a lot of businesses want to hire people that are on parole, I would imagine.
Some don't, but Ben, what's interesting is that I think one of the side benefits of having really low unemployment is a lot of people are looking for workers. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of businesses out there who are willing to take a chance on somebody. And yeah, if they screw up, they're done. But give them the opportunity. It's amazing how many of them take advantage of that opportunity, do well, and come back. And, you know, we do what are called early release hearings, too. So if somebody goes out in the community on parole, does really well, gets a job, puts everything back together, and there's no issues, we allow their caseworker, parole officer to ask for an early decision hearing to essentially end their parole. So we can,
Oh, so they're done.
they're done.
Oh, nice.
So and we try not to make that too far from their max date, but it gives us an opportunity to reward them for really doing well in the
Right,
community and
right.
getting their life back together. And their supervisor and parole officer will tell us there's nothing that we have to do to manage this person
Right.
anymore. So we would make the decision to terminate their parole agreement and end their
So,
sentence.
so the parole date, typically, you're on parole from the minimum release date or whenever you get approved for parole,
To
and
the
that's
max.
typically to the max date.
That's correct.
And so parole is it essentially a way to reintegrate and monitor someone who's trying to reintegrate back into the community?
I look at it as a transition, Ben. If someone is arrested, convicted, incarcerated, Vermont has a wonderful system. When we go to these conferences around the country, a lot of states are envious of how we get to
Really?
operate
Good for
because
us.
we have a transitional period where people can go from being incarcerated before their minimum back into the community on what's called conditional reentry. If they haven't had any discipline issues while they've been incarcerated, they can go on to what's called a conditional reentry. It's a very strict form of community supervision. So it gives them an opportunity to sort of test the waters in the community before the
Nice.
parole board sees them. So then we see them. And that's why there are 16 sites that we go to.
Right.
Half of them are jails and half of them are the probation and
And is
parole
that because
officers.
that's where they are?
They're
and that's
already in
their
the
family
community.
is there and-
Well, they're already in the community.
Yeah.
So we would go to, say in Burlington, we would go to the Chittenden Correctional Facility on one day, and on another day, we'll go to the Burlington Probation and Parole Office.
Oh, nice.
And so we'll see people that are eligible for parole who are in the community on furlough, conditional reentry, and are ready for parole.
So who decides conditional reentry? Who gets
Corrections.
to decide? So the corrections
There's
department.
criteria for it. The legislature changed the conditional reentry furlough laws a couple of years ago to allow people to be eligible, I think it's 90 days before their minimum. And if they don't have any discipline issues and they're doing well, that gives them a chance to get them back into the community. And then if they're doing well on CR or conditional reentry or furlough, they can recommend them for parole. And sometimes we want to see a little longer period of time if they've had some furlough issues.
And is that just for like nonviolent offenders, or is that for
No,
everyone?
Everyone is
Interesting.
potentially eligible.
How
Gotcha.
big is this housing issue that I keep hearing about?
It's
That some
huge.
people are
It's
at
huge.
this. I find this really bad. That if you've gone up to your maximum or whatever, they won't release you because you don't have appropriate housing, and that just
Well, it's a it's a tough situation, Pat, because corrections now will release people that are not listed offenders, and listed offenders are the more serious crimes, if they don't have an approved residence in some cases. But when they come before the parole board, we want them to have a residence. We're not going to put
course.
somebody on parole who's just going
Right.
to be living on the street,
Right.
couch surfing.
well, we
that
don't
could-
want that either. The
And
community
you don't
doesn't
want it either, so it's
Right.
it's a tough situation. But what's good about what we can do versus corrections is sometimes the residences can't be approved for somebody on furlough. Someone who has Section 8 housing, for example.
Right.
Furlough is considered an extension of incarceration. They can't be living in there, but they can be there on parole. So if a residence may not be approved for
Why is that rule in place?
it has to do with the nature of the crime and the status of them either being incarcerated for that offense
Right.
versus being on parole.
Oh, okay.
And so we can have the flexibility to put somebody in a residence. We still want it to be an approved residence,
Right.
but it wouldn't otherwise qualify. So, you know, and part of the problem area is when someone is non-listed in the community, doesn't have a residence, and they come to us, we're not going to parole them until we know they've got a place to
Right.
go.
Right. Well, we've had a couple of shows on housing, and
Yeah.
I mean, there's a shortage in almost every level.
Right.
Middle-income people,
Sure.
people coming here to find jobs, they can't find places to live that they can afford. It's really
There's
sad.
some wonderful transitional housing programs. I'm sure you've heard of
Yes,
some of
right.
them. Dismiss House being one of them,
Yep.
where people can go into a program like that. They can be in treatment. They can transition from a supervised residence to an apartment and then on their own. And those kind of programs are great. But
right.
there tends to be a waiting list, too.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, if you got those numbers every
Yeah.
year, 1,000 something, that's, what is the SCS?
SCS is a supervised community sentence.
Different than parole? or
Well, supervised
part of it?
community sentence is a different sentence than someone who's sentenced for a particular crime. So the court has the option there's probation. For
Right.
example, if you were convicted of a crime, you can be given a sentence of, say, 3 to 5 years and put on probation. So the parole board's not going to see you if you're on probation. You're in the community, you're on probation. But if you mess up, the court's going to revoke your probation.
Right.
And you're going to go to a 3 to 5 year sentence. Supervised community sentence is another form of sentencing that the court uses, and it sentences someone to a minimum and a maximum date, but they're in the community initially. They set the conditions for the person.
Oh.
And what's interesting about it is, say, for example, you live in White River Junction. If you're on furlough, conditional reentry, you can't leave Vermont and go to New Hampshire for work unless you're on parole. If you're on parole, you're allowed to leave the state with permission. If you're on furlough or conditional reentry, you can't. Like I said, it's a real.
Tight.
Interesting.
But on an SCS conviction, you can leave the state for employment or other reasons. The difference is the SCS offender comes before the parole board. They would meet us at their minimum, again, even though they're in the community. One of the options for us at the minimum is to discharge them from that sentence completely.
Huh.
So it's a huge advantage to
That's
be on an
great.
SCS case. A lot of the lower DUI offender, multiple DUI offenders, many of them are going to SCS cases. Different parts of the state use it more than others.
Really cool.
But it gives us the flexibility. They're essentially on parole when we see them. And when we see them at their minimum, one of the options is to dismiss them or to continue them on SCS or to revoke their SCS if there's a violation.
Wow.
And if we revoke their SCS, one of the tricky things is they may have a minimum that stay still a year away. They're not eligible to be in the community until that minimum. So they say could have been in the community for 6 or 8 months, messed up, lost their SCS. Now they got to go back and wait in jail until that minimum date. So we're
rough.
really careful
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
how we.
So if you're, so the people are like tiptoeing around on parole, like there's a real chance you could end up incarcerated again if you do something that violates the parole.
Right, you're still being supervised, well, not as intensely as you are on furlough or if you're incarcerated, and in many cases it's administrative supervision. But what happens is you'll get picked up for committing another crime, and then, whoa, that
Yeah.
raises the.
And committing, and I got to imagine the conditions of release for pretty much every is you don't commit a crime.
Well, there's
like-
one of the things we did last year in our manual was we had a consultant that we had a scholarship for. We came in and looked at parole conditions, and we used to have 32 conditions. And so we, like many states, have really focused on looking at over-conditioning people. So now we have 4 general conditions, and one of them is that you can't commit a crime,
Yeah,
or violate any
that's
laws.
sort of
Well,
a no-brainer.
so,
Yeah.
so one of the questions I have on
Hello?
that on
Yeah.
that process triggered a question earlier, and something you said is because you have a lot of people that come back to a parole violation hearing if they're for example they're struggling with substance abuse and they have a controlled substance violation,
Right.
and they come
They
back.
test positive.
Does that actually put more of the burden on the parole board than it would on the criminal justice system? Because those people normally, if they were not on parole, would be going to a court hearing as opposed to a parole board
Right.
hearing.
Well, if it's a substance abuse issue, Ben, and that's what most of them tend to be, we have 2 categories of violations, technical and non-technical. So if you're abusing drugs
Right.
and the person that you're hurting is yourself, it's a technical violation. If you didn't show up for an appointment with your parole officer,
Oh,
that's a
that's not-
technical
yeah.
violation. A non-technical one would be if you committed a new offense.
So something totally different than what was
Right.
original.
So when we
Okay.
look at the violation, a lot of times it's nipping this problem in the bud. It's certainly not unusual for people that are having challenges with substance abuse to relapse, even the ones that have been through a number of treatment programs.
Yep.
Not unusual. But did they relapse while they were driving a car and got in an accident? Or did they relapse at home and nobody else was affected? Big difference.
Yeah,
Right.
So if there's a way that we can refocus their treatment in the substance abuse area and keep them on parole after this violation hearing, that's what we want to do.
So run this by me again. So a technical violation would be they violated the terms of their parole, but they didn't necessarily commit an
Right.
additional crime.
One
They
of their
didn't hurt anyone.
conditions might be, Ben, that you cannot purchase, possess, or consume any regulated drugs, including misusing a prescribed drug, and you must submit to a drug. Well, if you're in a treatment program, part of the treatment program includes regular UAs for drugs.
Okay. Yep.
So they want to make sure that you're clean. And if you're in a maintenance program for opioids,
Right.
Suboxone or methadone or what have you, buprenorphine, they want to make sure that you're not abusing other drugs. So they test them every time.
So they test you. Okay.
Right. So if they fail, then their parole officer can choose to bring them back. And a lot of times, if it's a first-time issue and there are not other issues related to it, we'll do a reprimand, we'll keep them on parole, we'll try to refocus, make sure they understand that how important it is.
Right.
One of the challenges, Ben, and it's less of a challenge now, is for the people that were addicted to heroin that are in the community and on a waiting list for one of these treatment programs.
Wow,
Oh.
sure.
So they're
That's-
buying buprenorphine
Yeah,
on the
right.
street, and they test positive for it, they come back before us.
What do you suppose? I
They're
mean,
in a
really?
catch-22.
No, exactly.
They're trying to,
Exactly.
we don't want them buying street drugs and
Right,
using street
right.
drugs. That's not good either. But, you know, we try to, how can we get this person into a
Right,
program somewhere?
right.
And it's amazing
Right.
how many of them will travel 2 or 3 hours a day to get
Yeah,
to
we
their
have a
program.
buprenorphine set up in Berlin, and they say the line in
Yeah.
the morning
Yeah.
Yeah.
is just
Or
just out of sight.
Suboxone or
Yeah,
any of,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And yeah, because a lot of them have
And
waiting
there's more and
lists.
more of those opening up, which has been great. So people in their own communities, and you earn the right to take home your prescription. So if you go a
Right.
period of time without abusing any
Right.
problems,
They'll give it to you.
they'll give it to you to take home for a week at a time, and
Right.
you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So
So it's interesting. So I have two questions. I think first is, can you make the conditions of, say for example, they were arrested for a DUI, right? Can you make one of the conditions of parole be that they can't consume alcohol?
Yes.
Is that
Oh,
a condition?
absolutely.
Because that's something legal to do as long as you.
oh
don't
yeah,
have-
there are many things legal
Right.
to do that can be a condition. For example, we don't want you to contact person A, B, or C. It could be a specific person that they were associated with during the commission of their crime. It could be a victim and of a domestic assault or something like that, or a sexual assault. We don't want you having contact with this person.
Right.
So, and there's no relief from abuse orders in play, and there may be no other restrictions. So technically, they could legally have contact with them, but we are making that restriction as part of their parole. Now, that may be something we modify down the road if it's a family member and things go well, and the victims tend to want to be part of the solution.
Or like
But
any
drinking-
interaction's got to be supervised or
Right.
something like that. Yeah.
But a DWI is an excellent example. If you're coming before the parole board and you've got 3 DUI convictions, you clearly have an alcohol issue.
Right.
And so one of the conditions is going to be, first, you can't drive a car unless you've got a restricted
Right,
driver's
right.
license. And another one's going to be you cannot purchase, possess, or consume alcohol,
Right.
period. And
Which is interesting because that's not something like a court couldn't do that, but a parole board can do that,
you
right?
know, I'm not sure that, I don't know if the court might be able to do that for conditions of release.
Yeah,
Okay,
I think
yep.
they can.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we make it a condition of parole where it's appropriate. And that's one of the things I mentioned earlier too, is we don't want to condition people for things that aren't appropriate for them. We wouldn't put that condition on everyone.
Right.
Obviously, if you don't have an
It's a
alcohol
real
issue.
test for a corrections
So-
officer, isn't it?
Yeah.
They must have 50, 60 cases,
Oh, yeah.
maybe more.
That's
Yeah.
it's
How
gotta
they
be.
keep track of
Right.
these folks.
So if someone, say, I'll stick with the DUI example. So say someone's on parole with a DUI conviction, right? And if they had like a domestic violence incident while they were on parole for a DUI, which is technically not associated with their
Right.
DUI, even if there was
Right.
alcohol involved, perhaps in the.
Right.
So that goes back to you guys and not
Yeah,
to a.
because one of the conditions is you can't commit any crimes.
Right.
So, yeah, that's a new offense.
So does that shift some of the burden because that's a condition of the parole? Does that shift some of the burden from the traditional corrections system into the
Oh, if it's a new
parole system?
offense?
No.
Because if it's a new offense,
No,
you
because
know.
the court is still going to find out some resolution to that new offense.
Okay.
The court may change their sentence. What's now a minimum of, say, January 1, 2018, if they're convicted of a domestic violence, even though their prior conviction was a DUI 3, if they are convicted of the domestic violence, the court may change their minimum sentence date to, say, next January.
Wow.
So, for example, like if someone committed I will stick with this example, they came back. This person who committed a domestic violence incident, who's on parole for something else, comes back to you guys. You decide that, you know, this person, we're not going to revoke their parole at this point, or maybe you do revoke parole, but let's, for argument's sake, say that you don't. Could they still be charged for that? They can still be charged for that initial crime.
Typically, when we see them at a violation hearing, they've been charged.
They've already been charged.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the parole officer gets wind that one of the people they're supervising has been arrested by the police for domestic violence. They immediately do up a parole violation report. And if the person is not incarcerated, they may ask us to put out a warrant for their arrest, and then we would hold them without bail.
You've got warrant and subpoena power too,
Yes,
don't you?
yep.
Right.
So then we would see them at a violation hearing, and typically the defense attorney would ask that the parole board reserve making its decision until the court has made its decision.
Gotcha.
So we might consider continuing disposition until the court has made its decision on the domestic violence, say it's a domestic violence case. Now, the court might have already arraigned this person, probably has, and sent conditions for release for that new offense. And then if we continued them on parole, continued disposition, where we haven't actually made a decision to revoke or not, we might set additional conditions. For example, you can have no contact with this person, you have to have a curfew and blah, blah, blah.
And that's on this new offense.
And that's while their disposition is being continued. It's not a condition of their parole, but it's a condition of their being released,
Right.
waiting disposition.
Right.
Wow.
So it's interesting because you could, even while they're waiting disposition on these new charges, you could revoke their parole and
Yes.
they'd be reincarcerated anyway, despite whatever the pending outcome is.
That's right.
Because
And
they can
that's-
only, if you pull them back, they can only serve to the maximum
Oh,
of that
that's-
of
that's
that
it.
sentence,
Right.
and then
All right.
you know the court.
One
can-
of the tricky things, and you raise an interesting issue that
It's
we
just-
wrestle with a lot,
yeah.
is if we revoke their parole and they've committed a new offense, they're not going to be released again until that offense is resolved. So
Right.
say 6 months down the road or a year down the road, the case gets dismissed. They've been waiting in jail that whole period.
Right.
So if they're in the community and the court has set conditions for their release pending the resolution of the criminal case, a lot of times, not every time, we would consider releasing them pending that decision as well. Now, we're still going to see them
Yep.
in the end and
Yep.
make a decision to revoke or not.
I can see why your folks need training.
This got complicated quickly.
Well, spinning.
You
So-
didn't read this manual. This,
Oh, I have
these are the
another manual?
statutes.
Oh, well, I actually referred to one of them. Do you use teleconferencing at all?
Yeah, we do.
I was involved in that when I was at DMV. That was,
Unfortunately, we don't use it the way we'd like to. Once a month, we do hearings for out of state. As you know,
Right,
we've got
right.
roughly 250 people presently housed in Pennsylvania. They've moved around different places. But people that are eligible for parole hearings are still eligible for
Sure.
parole hearings.
Right.
And we don't go there. So we do video conferencing
Right.
for those
Do you
hearings.
find that useful or better
What's-
than traveling, I would
What's,
think?
yeah, better than traveling, but what's been challenging, Pat, is, especially the last time, is that we used to have a television monitor and a pretty good connection audibly with the person. We could see
Right.
them, they could see us. If there were family members present, they could see each other and that kind of thing. It's been a struggle to get the visually part
Oh,
of
that's
that
too bad.
up and running now.
Because that really makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I have a former officer in the commercial vehicle enforcement always said you had to see them in person to get a sense of,
Yeah.
how they're feeling,
Of
you know,
course.
body language
You
and
get,
that sort
yeah,
of
you
thing.
get so much more information through
Well,
that. Yeah.
you know, and when we go to these conferences occasionally with other states, big states, parole boards don't see the offenders.
Yeah.
They read reports.
Oh, really? They don't
Oh,
even
wow.
see
You
them?
know, no.
Oh, good for us.
So is
That's-
that one of the advantages you see in the way that Vermont does it?
Absolutely. A
And-
small state can afford the luxury of doing in-person interviews. And the other thing, there are some states that when they hear that we do the interview and we make the decision then in front of them, they say, "You're kidding. You make your decision to parole or not? Well, they're there." Well,
Right.
yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was good for us.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I believe it was Carol Kostelnik, you know.
Oh,
and-
yes.
But she said, you really need to be there.
I agree
to
with her,
look
yeah.
at their eyes, to
Yeah.
just see the emotion.
Well, the interview for us is such an important part of the process because it's a way for us to interact with them, hopefully get the positive things that are going on in their lives and
Right,
focus on
right.
that and get them moving in the right, because we don't want to have them keep coming back.
Have you, I
Right.
just thought, in the legislature, have you ever been up there to testify on
Many
things?
times.
Yeah, on the box, is that an active bill now?
The box.
The box about you don't have to check off whether you've been incarcerated or not?
No, I haven't.
That's a,
The only
I
thing
think
that
that's
I-
out there. I don't think they've, maybe it's not active, but there's a proposal that the box that says check here, if you ever, that you don't have, they're gonna eliminate that. And I don't know whether that helps, would help in getting an employment.
Well, a lot of times, you know, when we talk to people and we talk about, especially if they're coming back with a violation, does your employer know what you were convicted of? And most of them want them to know.
Right,
And I think being upfront and honest about what happened, and it's in the past,
right.
most people, you know, are willing to accept that.
Maybe offer more help to you too.
Yeah.
You know,
support.
and that, you know, why be living under
Because
the,
I can
Yeah.
think of situations where, like, if you're a manager, or if you're in charge of money or anything
Right.
like that, where you know your employer
Theft,
might
right.
want
Of course.
to know that
you were
know,
convicted of embezzlement.
You were
That's
convicted,
right.
exactly.
Yeah.
That might
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
important just a
Yeah,
little
right.
bit.
Yeah.
But so I think but I got to imagine that the parole officers work with companies.
do.
Say here's what we think this person, this is their record. This is the things that they've done while incarcerated. You know, here's we think their chances of success are.
There are so many opportunities for work in this state for people that can start out, even as, say, in restaurants as a dishwasher. And I can't tell you how many times we've got somebody out on parole that's working in a restaurant at the low end, and then when we see them towards the end of they're now the chef in charge of the restaurant.
How
They're
cool
doing
is
great,
that?
and assistant manager, and
Yeah.
they're so happy to come back and show us all the things they've done.
Great.
That's great. I mean,
And my understanding is Vermont has a lower recidivism rate than a lot of other
It does,
states do,
yeah.
and I think part of that's a testament to our commitment to getting people back into the
Right.
community.
and focusing on the positive, not the
Yeah.
negative.
Yeah.
You know, too many
But-
states still say, all right, you need to be punished for the rest of your life for this. You
Right.
know?
Right, well, there's so many, I mean, seriously, communities, and we should look to Barry to see all the stuff they have there to support. There's committees of people that support somebody. It's
Yeah,
really,
it is, it
I have a
is.
friend of mine who always works with people that have been released,
Yeah.
just to help them out.
So one other thing that we haven't talked about is medical paroles.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and what is that
Right.
process
And
look
that's
like?
one of the bills that I testified on quite a bit last year, which passed the House and now is in the Senate. And that dealt with the whole issue of the aging population
Oh, yes.
and medical parole. And right now, the language is pretty specific that you've got to be in a documented terminally ill situation for us to consider medical parole. And what the language that's in this new bill allows for is a serious medical condition. So that would give the parole board the flexibility. So if you're not going to reach your minimum, say, for another 5 years, but you have a serious medical issue, you're no threat to the community.
Right.
You know, you shouldn't be sitting in jail. You need to be getting,
Home with
you
your
know,
family,
and
right.
yeah, there are issues with, you know, victims and that sort of thing, and we understand that, but the reality is people with serious medical conditions that aren't being treated properly, the opportunity to be out of the incarcerated situation, we're not forgiving them for what they did.
Right.
We're finding a way to sort of deal with their illness, which
Yeah.
we don't have that flexibility now.
And is that can those? I mean, I know there are different situations you can work around with, like mental illness, for example. If you have like a degenerative disease or something like that, you know, there are secure facilities that hospitals have.
Not enough, though.
And not
Yeah,
enough.
no.
This is
Yeah.
this is an issue that we've talked about
Yeah,
a lot.
Oh,
right.
tell me.
It's-
Yeah.
We
Right.
have a Washington County Mental Health, Mary Moulton comes on the show a lot, and the situation out
It's
there
in
is really
crisis.
grim.
My wife is an ER nurse in
Oh, yes,
Middleburg.
that's right, I forgot.
And so
Allison.
it's not uncommon for them to have 2 patients in the emergency room who are being housed there 24 hours a day
Right, because there's no
or-
room.
because they're mentally incapacitated. And they're a threat for people coming in, the
Yeah.
nursing staff. They've got to have deputy sheriff. We just don't have the
Yeah.
places to put them. And they
Yeah,
don't
Berlin
belong in
has-
jail.
Berlin
and-
has 2
yeah.
officers in the
Yeah.
emergency room every night.
Yeah,
You have
Yeah.
to because
Yeah.
yeah,
you know
That's a
it's a huge issue.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
I don't know what the answer is. I was talking to somebody who was retired from Human Services, and he said he always thought we were doing the right thing. He said, but now he's not so sure. And,
Yeah.
and he doesn't know the answer,
Right.
what the right answer is. So,
Well, part of it is having more mental health capacity rooms for them to be in
Yeah.
in a hospital
Well, that's just
situation.
and the staff too. There's just
Yeah.
not enough staff
Right.
because they can't. A lot of these, designated agencies can't compete on a price basis with the hospitals, and
Yeah.
so they can't hire enough staff. They don't have the capacity to
right.
deal with a lot of these issues. It's just this. We
And
have. It's
it's-
not a program, a problem we've been able to solve.
Yeah.
I don't think
Right.
it's the first part of medicine that people want to volunteer to get into. There's other areas that pay
right.
more and
Yeah.
a little bit,
Yeah.
dealing with my
Well,
husband. what he was
if Washington County Mental Health can only pay me $15 an hour, but Central Vermont Medical Center can pay me $25
right,
an hour.
hello.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, where do
Exactly.
you think I'm going to go? You know.
Right. There's
Dean, we
gotta
just
be-
have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to make sure we covered this exciting
We've covered a lot.
topic. Yes, we did.
Yeah, lots of
It's a
territory.
very good book you wrote. Bruce goes, "What are you reading?" I said, "I'm practicing to be a parole board." And then,
I'll remember that next time there's an opening.
oh,
Pat.
yeah. Well, but I found it was, I actually read all of the points about you have the general, everybody gets paroled with these general, and then you've got this list of special items. And can't imagine you forgot anything. And there were some things I'm like, whoa, I wouldn't have even thought of
Yeah.
that.
The
I wish I
special
had brought some
conditions.
examples.
Yeah.
I'm
but
sure you've seen some interesting things.
Yeah.
and-
We have,
yeah.
you know, and to be able to find a way to get these people focused on being in the community and successful, and that's one of the things you said. You know, we don't hear a lot about the parole board. Well,
don't.
and that's good.
Yeah,
we
I
don't.
guess so,
we don't want to
'cause
be on the
nothing-
headlines.
Nothing I
Right.
presume
You know.
Yeah,
happens.
nothing too controversial.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
when I was talking to Bruce, who's worked with the Dean of State Police, you must have a few words thrown at you or through a few threats thrown your way by some of these
Not
folks.
very often, though,
No,
Pat.
they're-
You know,
That's
we-
why we don't hear.
We've really focused, and there are people that are disappointed.
Right.
I mean, and it's not unusual for us to have lawsuits from people who don't get what they want.
Right.
And so it's, occasionally we have to deal with those kinds of things. But in large part, it's because they haven't completed the programs that they're required
so
to
they're-
do.
it's very clear they're
Yeah,
in charge.
and they're
of
looking
this.
for another way for us to make a decision to get them out on parole.
Right.
And
so
there is an appeals process, right, for the
we have a reconsideration process.
Reconsideration,
And that's essentially for someone who has new information that wasn't presented to us at the hearing. So if, for example, we denied parole to somebody and then we got a letter from the person and their family or whatever asking us to reconsider that because X, Y, and Z was not allowed to be there or you didn't get that information.
or their lawyer did a bad job.
Well, they're not entitled to be
They're not-
represented at it.
Oh,
only
they're
at the
not
violation
entitled.
hearings.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So only the violation hearing. So
Right.
can they choose to be represented by a no? They can only represent themselves.
No, and it's
Interesting.
not unusual for an attorney to come in with them occasionally.
But the attorney
And we
cannot
make it
speak
clear
on
to
their behalf.
them that you can't represent them. If you want to present us information, we're happy to listen to you, but you can't.
The offender has to
Interesting.
speak for him
That's
or
right.
herself.
That's right.
That's interesting. So it is in that way at least quite a bit different than
Yeah.
than
It's when you get to the violation phase of things where you run into the due process,
Right.
evidentiary.
right. So you have to have if the person either has to have their own lawyer or a
Right.
public defender. Or
Parole
something.
is discretionary, but there are many guidelines, and so because of that, it's a decision made by the board, and the majority of the three there make the decision.
Interesting.
And
I
that's
didn't
all on the
realize that.
record, so if there's
It's
a
all on
court
the rec-
case,
Yep.
it's part of that court case.
And sometimes when it
De
goes back to
novo.
the court will send it back to us and ask us, they will remand it back to us and ask us to conduct another hearing.
Oh,
And we do.
okay,
You know, if we don't, we have no problems with that
Interesting.
whatsoever. Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Well, we must thank you very much
Yeah.
for appearing on the show.
My pleasure.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank
Another
you so
learning
much.
opportunity.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening in. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.